The quiet, persistent buzz of the city was the only constant in Uncle Joel's small, trinket-filled apartment. Carl knew that hum better than his own heartbeat these days. It was the sterile, monotonous backdrop to the daily ritual, the rhythmic pulse of his quiet, deliberate crime. Every morning, with a detached precision that bordered on surgical, Carl would pull out the familiar ingredients. The white bread, soft and yielding beneath his fingertips. The crisp, green fan of lettuce. The blushing, perfectly circular slices of tomato. And the pale, unblemished turkey. And then, without fanfare, came the other ingredient. A tiny, almost invisible pinch of crystalline powder, dissolved perfectly and irrevocably into the creamy swirl of mayonnaise, vanishing like a bad thought into the mundane. Carl often found himself whistling, a tuneless, off-key sound that grated on the silence of the apartment, a sound only he truly heard. He was, to anyone observing, the very picture of a dutiful, even loving nephew. His smile was an effortless flash of white teeth, perfectly symmetrical, and his eyes, when he chose, could hold a practiced warmth, a seemingly genuine spark of interest, a trick he'd perfected years ago. Most people bought it. The charming, attentive young man who seemed so devoted to his ailing uncle. They didn't see the thin, brittle wire of his patience, stretched taut to breaking point, or the cold, calculating engine that hums ceaselessly beneath the surface of his carefully constructed persona. He was, at his core, a sociopath, pure and simple, and he viewed others as nothing more than props in his personal play, tools to be used, obstacles to be removed, or stepping stones to a more comfortable existence. And this whole charade with Uncle Joel, this tedious, drawn-out performance, was simply a means to a singular, uncomplicated end: inheritance. Uncle Joel was, Carl supposed, a decent enough man. Calm, unflappable. A former diplomat, now retired, his life had been a series of meticulously planned journeys and exotic acquisitions. His two-bedroom apartment, though small by Carl's aspirational standards, was a living museum, every surface groaning under the weight of memory and distant lands. The air itself seemed heavy, thick, with the scent of aged paper, forgotten spices, and something else now. A faint, persistent tang of infirmity, a subtle metallic note that Carl, with his keen, unsentimental senses, could just detect. There were the smooth, cool ivory carvings of elephants from Tanzania, their trunks raised in silent salute. The intricately lacquered boxes from Vietnam, each one a miniature universe of applied art. A faded but vibrant tapestry from Afghanistan, depicting a scene of hunters and gazelles, its threads worn thin by countless sunrises. Joel would drone on about them sometimes, his voice a low, comforting murmur, recalling the markets, the smells, the negotiations. Carl didn't listen, he merely endured, his gaze sweeping over the treasures, seeing not history or beauty, but merely an accumulation of useless, dusty junk that stood as a physical barrier between him and Joel's eventual, and in Carl's mind, overdue demise. The poison was subtle, a testament to Carl's meticulous research. He'd spent weeks scouring hidden corners of the dark web, sifting through arcane forums and cryptic chemical schematics for something truly undetectable. He wanted nothing dramatic, no sudden telltale collapse that would alert authorities or family friends. No, that was far too risky. He wanted a prolonged, agonizing drift into oblivion, a natural-looking fade, that mimicked the insidious creep of age or some mysterious wasting illness. It was perfect. No distinct taste, no immediate dramatic reaction, just a slow, insidious wearing down, a gradual erasure of a man's vitality. The aim, after all, was to inherit discreetly, not to be investigated. Each day, with the chilling predictability of a well-oiled machine, the change would begin a few hours after Joel had consumed the meticulously prepared turkey sandwich with lettuce and tomato on white sliced bread. Joel would grow quiet, his keen, intelligent eyes, once so bright with the spark of a traveler's curiosity, clouding over with a bewildering fog. A vague, persistent headache would start, a dull throb behind his temples, sometimes intensifying to a sharp, disorienting pressure. Sometimes his hands would tremor imperceptibly as he reached for his teacup, or a fine sheen of cold sweat would break out on his forehead, even in the cool apartment. His steps, once spry for a man his age, would become heavy, his usually fluid movements replaced by a shuffling gait, as if his feet were weighted with lead. His speech would become slurred, just a fraction, enough for Carl to notice the subtle shift from calm to confused, from well-traveled to wandering. He'd struggle to string together sentences, his thoughts dissolving like sugar in hot tea, leaving him grasping for words that hovered just beyond his reach. He might forget the names of his favorite cities, or stumble over the punchline of a story he'd told 100 times, his voice trailing off into a confused murmur. "Feeling a bit off, Uncle Joel?" Carl would ask, his voice dripping with a carefully calibrated feigned concern. He'd press a cool hand to Joel's forehead, his touch gentle, almost tender, a masterstroke of theatrical empathy. "You look a little peaked. Must be that wretched bug going around." He'd lead Joel gently to his bedroom, pulling the curtains to create a false dusk, and smooth the covers with a solicitous sigh. The old man, too weary to resist the profound fatigue that claimed him, would sink into a deep, almost comatose sleep. Carl would then return to the living room, a thin, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Another dose delivered, another step closer. The truly infuriating part, the one that gnawed at Carl's already frayed nerves, was that Joel would feel better every single morning. The poison, as effective as it was at creating immediate malaise, was proving to be a frustratingly slow grind, a weak, diluted horror that merely gummed up Joel's gears instead of grinding them to a halt. Its effects were temporary, like a bad dream that faded with the morning light, leaving only a vague, unpleasant taste. He'd wake up disoriented, certainly, a lingering fogginess in his mind, but refreshed enough to function, enough to pour himself a cup of coffee, and, maddeningly, enough to eat another sandwich. The cycle repeated, a maddeningly slow dance of decay and frustrating recovery. Carl's short temper, usually reserved for trivial irritations like gridlocked traffic or an incompetent barista, simmered dangerously beneath his composed facade. A familiar acid burned in his gut when Joel repeated himself, and Carl had to clench his fists deep in his pockets, the nails biting into his palms to keep the mask of concern from cracking. It was an exercise in self-control that chafed at his very being, like a cheap suit on a hot day. Now, a full month had passed. 30 days of meticulously prepared sandwiches, each one a tiny act of insidious violence. 30 days of watching Joel grow visibly paler, thinner, his sharp wit dulled to a hazy confusion. He spent more and more time in bed, often simply dozing in his armchair, the once vibrant tapestry on the wall a blur to his unfocused gaze. His movements were slow, his once animated gestures replaced by a lethargic listlessness. He was a shadow of his former self, a frayed and crumbling tapestry of the man he once was, a ghost haunting his own life. And yet, frustratingly, stubbornly, he clung to it with the tenacity of a barnacle to a rotting hull. Carl stood over Joel's bed, the dim light filtering through the drawn curtains. The old man was lying perfectly still, eyes closed, his breath shallow, a thin wheeze in his chest. The room was dark, filled with the looming, silent forms of Joel's collected treasures. The jade elephant seemed to peer from the bedside table. The carved mask on the wall seemed to grin. The tiny mosaic box gleamed dully. They seemed to watch Carl, ancient witnesses to his burgeoning, uncontrollable impatience. "Still with us, hey, Uncle Joel?" Carl murmured, his voice flat, devoid of its usual charm, edged with a raw frustration he barely bothered to conceal. There was a palpable aggression simmering just beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. He'd wasted an entire month on this, an entire month of his precious time, playing the devoted nursemaid, mixing poison, watching a man slowly, agonizingly not die. The inheritance, when it finally materialized, wouldn't be nearly enough to compensate for this infuriating, soul-sucking delay. The entire venture felt like a profound miscalculation. A sudden, sharp, almost violent impatience surged through Carl. He couldn't stand it anymore. This slow, predictable, inefficient process felt like trying to empty a swimming pool with a teaspoon. There were other ways to get rich, faster ways, less tedious ways, schemes that promised immediate gratification rather than this agonizing, drawn-out waiting game. He had other get-rich-quick schemes already brewing in his mind, grander, bolder, less reliant on the slow, uncooperative erosion of an old man's liver. He was done. He spun on his heel, the movement sharp and decisive. "I'm heading out, Uncle Joel," he said, his voice clipped, final, and devoid of any pretense of care. "Got things to do." He didn't wait for a response, didn't even glance back at the still figure in the bed. He stalked out of the bedroom, past the silent, judging trinkets that now seemed to mock his failure, and out the apartment door. The sharp click of the lock was a dismissive period at the end of a very unsatisfying, protracted sentence. Joel stirred hours later. The worst of the fog had lifted, as it always did. A small mercy, but a profound weakness lingered, making his limbs heavy and his head light. He pushed himself upright, his head throbbing faintly, a dull echo of the day's malaise. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, a peculiar, unsettling silence. "Carl?" he called out, his voice a frail croak that vanished into the emptiness. Only silence answered, a vast, indifferent void. He shuffled into the kitchen, his mind a hazy muddle, a lingering sense of disorientation clinging to him like damp air. The counter was empty. No sandwich makings, no note, no sign of his nephew. Joel frowned, a vague, disquieting sense of abandonment stirring within him, mixing with the persistent sense of being unwell. He'd been feeling so peculiar these last few weeks. this inexplicable, recurring illness. Joel, however, simply wondered where Carl had gone, and why, for the past month, he'd felt so strangely, unnervingly, the subtle, insidious decay, a mystery even to himself.